I'm Tom Mariam. I've been a member of the New York Financial Writers Association since 1982, which is now 41 years.
So, how did you get started in the organization?
It takes me back to when I started in financial journalism, and I owe a lot of it, if not everything, to Robert Dallas. Bob was the New York correspondent for the Los Angeles Times when I met him. He was a former president of the New York Financial Writers Association. Just a quick backstory on that: when I had the idea in college that I wanted to go into journalism, my father said, "You should meet a real life journalist." And I didn't know any. And he said that a member of our synagogue son was the correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and that was Bob Dallas's mom. Set it up, and Bob was very generous about keeping in touch with one another. And then he led me to my first job in financial journalism at the Wall Street Journal. They just started a broadcast division, and I had a master's degree in broadcast journalism, and I wound up getting hired there. And along the way, Bob had mentioned the New York Financial Writers Association, also Rudy Ruderman, whom I worked with at the Wall Street Journal broadcast division, talked about the Follies and the financial writers, so I joined. And 1982, and the first thing I did was the Follies, and here we are 41 years later.
So, what are your most memorable uh, uh, memories of the Follies?
There are many. I mean, the broadest one is just the friendships and the camaraderie of the Follies. There's one that's slightly tangential to it, and that is that we started a tradition, my second year in the Follies, 1983, of going to brunch the day after. And we'd be at the Follies till the middle of the night, and we wouldn't leave the hotel till 2 a.m., sometimes go out even after that. So it would be a late morning, but we would go out to brunch somewhere and just keep it going until late that Saturday afternoon. And so that's a big part of it, was the overall friendships that we had and the camaraderie for it. But from the show itself, I go back to the first couple of Follies that I was in. My first year was 1982, and I didn't know what to expect. We had a dress rehearsal on Sunday, and we were told to bring friends and relatives. So I invited my parents, I invited my girlfriend at the time, and I invited a couple of close friends to see the dress rehearsal. We bombed. We were terrible. Jerry Goldstein, our director, had us do over parts 3-4 times. It was a total mess. My friend's wife calls me up when I get home and says, "I just was awarded a scholarship by the New York Financial Writers Association, and in those days we gave it out at the Follies that night." She said, "But do I have to go to the show again?" I just saw it. It was terrible. I said, "I guess you have to go." And she did go. And we were great on stage that night. One of the key figures that we mocked was Henry Kaufman, who earlier that year had proclaimed that we were going to finally have a bull market, and the market just went to record highs at the time, broke 1,000, which of course seems quite low these days, but back then that was quite a landmark for the Dow to rise over 1,000. He was at the show. Bob Cosma did an incredible version of "I Am the Very Model of the Modern Day Economist" from the Gilbert and Sullivan song. Kaufman was there. He loved it. It was such a good feeling the way the show went that night, and that really sparked my love, if you will, for both the Follies and for the Financial Writers Association. The second year in the show, I started to take a little more active role in it. And I like to write comedy, and being a news writer professionally, I wrote a couple of our mock newscasts. We used to put them in between scenes, so while the cast was changing, we would come up with a mock newscast. And one I remember in particular was that Sims went public, and Sims was a clothing store, I believe just for men, but it was a big clothing store chain around the New York, actually it was national. And their gimmick was that they would already have low prices, and then they would mark down their prices after 30 days and after 60 days and whatever. And they went public that year. So I wrote a news story, and we had it as Cy Sims. Hi, this is Cy Sims. I want to tell you about our amazing new stock offering. We already offer our shares at a low price, but after 30 days, we cut the share price to 50%. And after 45 days, 75%, and anything left over, we just give to Carl Icahn, who at the time was one of the big celebrity investors. And the place laughed. And it was such a great feeling to see that there. And then afterwards, I remember Art Szymanski, who's been a good friend of mine over the years in the Financial Writers, coming up and saying, "You're really funny," and that was really very heartwarming, because on stage, as Jerry Goldstein told us, don't quit your day job. Actually told me. There's a lot of our people could have quit their day jobs for entertainment careers, but in my case, I was just in the backdrop there. But another memory that I have was one year we did a Margaret Thatcher spoof, and we had Chippendale dancers behind Margaret. Actually, I think it was a man who actually had the role. I'm trying to think who played that particular character of Margaret Thatcher. But anyway, we were all dressed in Chippendale outfits. We had these spandex pants on, and above the waist, the only thing we had were bow ties. And Steve Gavoni, who's quite talented, was supposed to lead that line, and basically I would follow who was in front of me. But Steve has seen before and hurt himself and could not participate in that. This is the dress rehearsal, and I remember our director, no, not our director, our choreographer, down below looking shocked to see me in front of the line. I was even more shocked at that. Luckily it was the dress rehearsal. I watched her movements, we got through it, and we made adjustments for the show itself. But there were just a lot of fun rehearsals that went with it more than anything else. And if you'd like, I can tell you about my first rehearsal, which I still remember quite well.
So tell me, what has being a part of the New York Financial Writers Association given to you over the years?
Everything. I can think of jobs that I got. I'll give you an example. When I joined the Financial Writers, as I mentioned, I was part of the team of the Wall Street Journal's broadcast division at Dow Jones. And after a few years there, it was time to look at some other opportunities along the way. And Rudy Ruderman, whom I mentioned before, had mentioned that they were looking for a writer at Standard & Poor's. I interviewed there, and the man who interviewed me said, "Oh, I've heard some good things about you," and said, mentioned Bob Dallas's name, whom I mentioned earlier. So I called Bob afterwards. I said, "I didn't even realize you were aware that I was interviewing. I appreciate it very much." He said, "Not a problem." He said, "There are a couple of other things if you're interested." He said, "This one I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, but the New York Post is looking for financial writers." I thought, okay, move into print, why not? I didn't think the business section was all that bad. In fact, it was quite good at the time, and became even better when Gerard Bray took over a couple of years later, our late president as well. And Bob said to me, "If you're interested," he said, "why don't you contact Bob Shabazian at the American Stock Exchange? Bob knows more than I do." And so I did, and I knew Bob a little bit from the Follies because he handled the props every single year. And we weren't friends as such at that point there, but I knew. And so Bob gave me all the information, and Bob calls me up about 10 days later. He said, "Have you heard anything yet?" And these are the days where all the correspondence was done by the U.S. Mail. There was no, there were phones, but there were just desk phones. There was no voicemail, there was no email, certainly no cell phones, nothing. Bob calls me up about 10 days later. "Have you heard anything?" "No, Bob, I promise you, if I hear anything, I'll let you know." Calls me up one more time. I said, "Oh my God, what's I can't get rid of this guy." Good intentions. He said, "Have you heard anything?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, that may be good." He said, "We're looking to bring in somebody to run broadcasting here at the American Stock Exchange. Looks like your background would fit. Would you be interested?" I said, "Sure." And indeed, I got that job. So there were connections there from Bob Dallas, Bob Shabazian, Rudy Ruderman has set that up. So that was really quite helpful. And then along the, other jobs along the line too. So that's, you owe your career to that, because everything I've done since is based on it. But I've had lifelong friendships through it. I even got engaged after a Follies cast party. We had one back in February of 2000, and I brought my date. And I already knew before the night that that's what I wanted to do. And we were at 35th Avenue. I forgot maybe that was even what it was called at the time. And we drove back to my place in Brooklyn, and I stopped at the Brooklyn Promenade. And I don't know why she got out of the car on a cold February night at midnight when she doesn't like cold weather and doesn't like to be out late. And I proposed to her. But that was linked also to, New York Financial Writers event as well.
Wow. So tell me, you've been a part of the association for 4 decades. How is the association different today from when you first joined?
I think it's different in a lot of ways. When I first joined, I was going to mention my first Follies rehearsal. So I walk into the Sheraton Hotel, into this big room, and there's the usual spread from Katz's Deli. Little did I know that would be my diet 2 nights a week every fall for about 20 years. Still made it though. And I'm sitting at a table, and there are several older men there. Uh, they were talking about the newspapers. They worked with the New York Herald Tribune, the World Journal Telegram, and things that are long past the time, and that's going back in history. Uh, and I looked at the membership there, and they all seem to work for well-known organizations: New York Times, Forbes magazine, Business Week, Wall Street Journal, etc. along the way. Journalism's changed, as you well know, and today our members come from a much wider range of places, a much wider range of publications. It's also no longer just writers, and I know that was a very strict thing. I think Rudy Ruderman was the first broadcaster who was accepted into the organization. Now people have multiple skills. I mean, Conway, you're a great example of that. You come out of television. So that's a big thing, is just the different areas that people come from. I think that people are much more well-rounded when it comes to knowledge of different industries. I think there are much broader sector of industries that are covered right now in the financial press. So I think that that's one big difference. I will say that the absence of a live on-stage Follies has changed the association, in the sense that we all gather twice a week, every week for 3 months, to do the Follies, and that built up friendships and kinships. They don't have that now, and the world's changed, and so it's the way we've evolved. So that's certainly a big difference. We used to have more in-person events. There was a monthly luncheon, usually at Gallagher's, with a guest speaker of a lot of renown, often CEOs or government officials, that we got together. So the events are different, but now they're on Zoom, and that widens the number of people who can participate. You don't have to say, "Oh, I can't get uptown for lunch anymore." Usually you can at least pop on a Zoom. We do more in the evening than we tended to do. And I think a lot of things have changed, but it's evolved, and that's the important thing. I don't think one's better than the other.
So talk to me a little bit about the way how you have changed in terms of the organization, because now you're not a journalist anymore, right? So there might be people who don't know like your new role and how that fits into you being still being a member of the Financial Writers.
I was actually a journalist only for the first couple of years, being a member of the organization. In 1984, I went to the American Stock Exchange. I gave a little background on that before. And that was part of the corporate communications department there. That being said, I was very much a journalist when I was at the Amex. I hosted a weekly radio show on business for 10 years called Amex Business Talk. I was the host. In fact, I had a lot of members of the association as our guests: Myron Candell, Lenny Sloan, Monica Roman, among others over the years, and we talked about all different subjects of business. We had the American Stock Exchange name on it, but it wasn't a promotional tool. It was a promotional tool because they had our name, but we weren't saying, "Oh, go trade your stocks and list your stocks on the Amex." That wasn't the point of it. Today, you'd call it a podcast. It was a 15-minute talk show, but I had some incredible guests on there: Walter Wriston, T. Boone Pickens, Ed Koch, and so that was very much a journalistic function within there. I was on WCBS every half hour for quite a few years, giving stock market updates. I was in there along with all the news anchors that we commonly hear. There's the sports people, the weather people. We were the first we were the first exchange anyway to have a live TV camera on our trading floor. And I built the first booth for CNBC. Their news director, John Wilkes, came up to me, I think it was even at a Follies, and mentioned that they wanted to build a broadcast booth. The New York Stock Exchange would not allow them, and asked me if we would be open to it. And I said, "I'm sure we are." And I brought it to our board, and we built it. And so for the first 5 years of their existence, that's all they had down in the Wall Street area. And I called it, by the way, John Wilkes Booth. and they had all kinds of guests obviously come up there, and then they eventually went to the New York Stock Exchange where you see them today. We had many others. Myron Kandel came down every afternoon for CNN, did a live spot from our trading floor, either himself or sometimes with a guest. FNN, the forerunner to CNBC, was there. Nightly Business Report, NHK from Japan. I facilitated this. So a lot of these were journalistic functions, but within the realm of a corporate communications job. And then I moved on to Rubenstein, the public relations firm there, and that was a pure PR job. I worked for Peter Rosenthal, the late Peter Rosenthal, the husband of Terry Thompson, another one of our former presidents, a longtime member, star of the Follies. And that led me to getting an offer from Booz Allen and Hamilton as the head of public relations there, and then into the law firm world. Cadwalader as the director of marketing communications, later on Clifford Chance, Curtis Mulray Prevost, Jones Day, and now my current position as the director of public relations at Seyfarth Shaw.
So tell me, you've had this storied career. If you were talking to a group of young student journalists, would you encourage them to get into the world of business, financial journalism now? And if so, why?
It's an interesting question as the father of a son who just graduated college and did work on his school newspaper, and a daughter who's majoring in communications as well. She enters her junior year. Unfortunately, journalism, as we've seen, has just been stripped away. We work here at Seyfarth in the same building as the New York Times. They demolished their sports department recently. I deal with a lot of their journalists. They're all very young. You can tell that these organizations are not paying much. But I didn't go into journalism either with the idea that I was going to get rich or famous. I went in because that was something I enjoyed doing. I always liked telling people about the news or trying to find out information and share it and interpret it. So if that's what your goal is, I think that that's great. You just have to understand the business that you're in right now. You do need to be multimedia talented. You need to be able to do video and audio, as well as being able to write, as well as being able to edit. But you can also take that background, as I and so many others have done over the years, and transfer it into a business where you can work in-house, either similar to what I did at the stock exchange, where you're doing a lot of editorial product there. A lot of companies have writers and videographers and video producers. They do their own podcasts as a podcast host, or into the more in the pure form of public relations, if you will, as well. A colleague of mine in the financial writers, the late Dave Kogut, once said, when you get down to it, all you're doing is sharing information, whether you're doing it as a journalist or whether you're doing it as a PR person.
So do you think that that's the biggest change in terms of financial journalism between now and when you started, is that the technology, the delivery has changed so much, and that means that the way how a journalist has to think has changed?
One of the things was working at the Wall Street Journal early on. There was a sacred time in the late afternoon around 5 o'clock when the copy pretty much had to be in. And we worked right there a little side by side with the newspaper, so I was totally exposed to that. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week business now. And I think that's a major change, that when I talk to reporters, I don't have to wait for the next day's newspaper. I'll see something. If I set up an interview for one of our lawyers, there's a pretty good chance if I set it up in the morning, it's out by 3 in the afternoon in the story. They may update the story as it goes on, but that's something that's changed quite a bit, is the fact that you're constantly on cycle here. There is no, okay, that's it, you missed the morning edition, you have to hold the story for 24 hours. That's now that we're online, it's just continuous. So that to me is a big change right there.
So let's flip that. We take a look at what has changed. What has not changed, despite the technological advancements? What skills are still required?
Well, all the basic communication skills. And I tell this to my kids and any young students that I meet: learn how to write clearly, write succinctly. And that's true whatever you do in any business, but certainly more so in journalism. Speak articulately, speak to the point. those are very key. And even if you're not a broadcaster, if you're going to be asking questions, get to it. You know, how many times have you heard somebody give a whole lecture before they get to the question? That's something that is a skill to have. But more than anything else is an appetite for the truth, a thirst for knowledge, an inquisitive mind, an open mind. Don't go in thinking you've written the story before you've actually written the story. You know, hear what people have to say that can turn it around 180 degrees, sometimes maybe even 15 degrees or so. But I think those skills are always there. The mind hasn't changed, and the mindset for the most part hasn't changed.
So we've been talking about things that have changed and have not changed. One thing that has changed is the environment, right, in which news is consumed. There's all this talk about, fake news and misinformation. And so I'm wondering, why do you think an organization like the New York Financial Writers Association is important in a time of increasing hostility towards media?
I think it's even more important now because the truth has to come out. And when you get into a society where the truth is not exposed, then you get in, that's when the lies take over. And that's really dangerous in many ways. Misinformation. I think a lot of people are not as informed as they should be, or they hear the first thing and that's it. And they immediately form their viewpoint. A lot of the great stories took months, years to formulate because the reporters didn't accept what happened. And we've seen movies, and Watergate was an example. And that was in the era when I was going to high school, and that made journalists into big time heroes there. And I think it's so important right now that we are able to shed the light on the truth or expose new things. And I'm not necessarily going into a falsehood versus what's the truth, but just to expose new trends, what's going on. I mean, how do we get your knowledge about anything that's happening now? How many people would know about artificial intelligence if it weren't being reported on by news media? I mean, what would we know? And I was fortunate to take a class at Columbia when I was an undergrad, taught by Fred Friendly, the former president of CBS News. It was on the faculty of the Columbia Journalism School, and did a number of TV shows for PBS. And he used to say, what you don't know can kill you. He was the producer for Edward R. Murrow, one of the great journalists ever, and certainly what he did to stop McCarthyism is legendary.
All right. Any other thoughts that you might want to share? In this legacy video, we're taking a look at it 10 years from now, something that you would want someone to know about you and your experience as in the world of journalism and your experience as part of the Financial Writers.
I think it's true in both, but even more so slightly in the Financial Writers. Don't be shy. And that was one of the great things about the organization, is that you did not have anybody who was not approachable. I saw so many examples of that. The young women who joined us. There was a time when women weren't that much of the population still in journalism. Claire Record, who I believe was the first female member of the Financial Writers, and maybe was the first female journalist at least financial writer at the New York Times. The story goes that they wouldn't let her use her byline Claire Record. It was CM Record. So people read it, thought, okay, CM must be a guy. And it wasn't. In the way that she took in these young women, she would approach them, or she was very approachable for it. I think that was really important. But it could be anybody, anywhere in the organization. I think that is something that, as long as you're willing to put yourself out there a little bit, others will approach you, and that's very important. And that's one of the most rewarding things, both on a professional level, as I gave some examples, and on a personal level.